My name is Evelyn Harper. I'm 35 years old, and this is the story of how I spent most of my life believing hard work would earn me a place in my own family, only to learn that love, in our house, was never distributed equally. The night everything broke open didn't start with shouting. It started with smiles. We were sitting in my parents' living room in Plano, Texas, the same room where every important family conversation had happened since I was a kid. Beige couches, framed graduation photos, the faint smell of lemon cleaner my mother used obsessively whenever guests were coming. My father stood up, cleared his throat, and smiled like a man about to announce a surprise vacation. "Your mother and I have made a decision," he said. "We're transferring the business and all family assets to your younger brother." The room went quiet. My mother beamed. My brother Ryan didn't even try to hide his grin. I didn't react right away. I just looked at him, then slowly stood up. "Congratulations, Ryan," I said calmly. Then I reached into my bag. I placed a heavy brass warehouse key on the coffee table, a thick stack of contracts, and one sealed envelope. Ryan grabbed the envelope first. 30 seconds later, his face went completely white. "This has to be a joke," he said. That was the exact moment everything they had planned for years began to collapse. But to understand why that envelope destroyed them, you need to understand how I grew up. I was raised inside a manufacturing business, not figuratively, literally. Harper Pure, our family's industrial water processing company, sat just 20 minutes from our house. The hum of machines and the smell of filtered minerals were as familiar to me as cartoons were to other kids. My father built the company in the late 90s. My mother managed the paperwork and finances. And then there was Ryan, 4 years younger than me, golden from the moment he could walk. Private schools, summer programs in Europe, a brand new car at 16. Meanwhile, when I turned 15, my father sat me down after dinner and said, "You're old enough to help now." The next morning, I was on the production floor in steel-toe boots, learning how to monitor pressure systems and identify faulty seals. While my friends were at the mall, I was logging inventory until midnight. While Ryan slept in, I opened the plant at 5 a.m. My mother would bring me leftover dinner around 10 at night and tell me I was doing such a good job supporting the family. Ryan would show up occasionally, grab the company truck, and disappear again. By 17, I was running weekend shifts alone. I knew every machine, every supplier, every emergency protocol. The workers listened to me, not because I was the boss's daughter, but because I knew what I was doing. I opened my first savings account with overtime checks. 6 months later, my mother asked to borrow the balance to cover Ryan's travel expenses for a soccer tournament in Spain. I never saw that money again. When I asked about it, my father said, "You're the older one. You understand responsibility." Ryan was sent to a private boarding school in Colorado. I stayed home and took online classes so I could keep the plant running. My stray days earned me extra shifts. Ryan's average grades earned him praise and gifts. By the time I was 20, I had stopped expecting fairness. I told myself this was temporary, that once the company stabilized, things would change. They didn't. In 2015, my father suffered a heart attack on the factory floor. The doctors said stress could kill him. That same week, my parents handed me full operational authority over Harper Pure. I was 25 years old, and suddenly, I was responsible for everything. I rebuilt failing systems, renegotiated supplier contracts, developed a new filtration method that beat national brands in lab testing. I personally secured a trial distribution agreement with a major national retailer, then turned it into a long-term contract. Revenue exploded. The company went from barely surviving to thriving. And when Ryan returned from college with a vague creative degree and no interest in operations, my parents welcomed him home like a savior. They called him the future. They called me reliable. That should have been my warning. By early 2024, things started to feel off. Meetings I wasn't invited to. Calendar blocks labeled family only. Documents passed across my mother's desk with titles like succession planning. Then Ryan posted a photo on Instagram. Him, standing in front of our warehouse sign, wearing a tailored suit. The caption read, "Future Owner." That night, my father called me into his office. "You're incredible at operations," he said without looking up. "But Ryan has the vision people like." I asked him what that meant for me. He shrugged. "You'll always have a job here." That was the moment something inside me finally stopped trying. After that meeting in my father's office, nothing felt solid anymore. I still showed up before sunrise, still checked every shipment, still answered supplier calls and late-night emails. But something had shifted. For the first time in my life, I wasn't working toward approval anymore. I was working while watching my own exit being planned behind my back. The signs were everywhere once I allowed myself to see them. Invoices I'd approved suddenly needed family review. My access to certain financial folders was quietly restricted. Ryan started attending meetings he didn't understand and speaking in them anyway. Every time he said something vague about brand energy or storytelling, my parents nodded like he'd just solved world hunger. When I pushed back with actual numbers, margins, and logistics, I was told I was being too rigid. Too rigid. The same rigidity that had kept the company alive when my father nearly died. One evening, I stayed late in my office, long after the factory had gone quiet. The hum of the machines faded until all I could hear was the buzz of fluorescent lights and my own breathing. I opened the filing cabinet I hadn't touched in years. Inside were old contracts, emails, signed authorizations. And then I found it. The durable power of attorney from 2015. Still active, still unrestricted. My name, my authority. I sat back in my chair and stared at it like it was written in another language. No one had ever mentioned revoking it. No one had ever replaced it. They'd simply assumed I would never question it. That night, I didn't sleep. I replayed every unpaid hour, every sacrifice framed as family duty. Every moment Ryan was celebrated while I disappeared into the background. By morning, exhaustion turned into clarity. If they were planning to take everything from me, they were going to do it using the systems I had built. And that meant the systems could work for me, too. I didn't act right away. I watched. I listened. I learned exactly how far they were willing to go. 2 weeks later, my mother hosted a dinner at the house. "Just family," she said. Ryan arrived late, wearing a new watch that cost more than my first car. Over roast chicken and forced smiles, my father casually mentioned that they'd been talking to advisors. "About the future," my mother added, squeezing Ryan's arm. I asked who the advisors were. My father waved it off. People Ryan knows. Creative consultants. Creative consultants. That was when Ryan leaned back in his chair, looked straight at me, and said, "You don't need to worry, Eve. You'll always be taken care of." Taken care of, not respected, not acknowledged, taken care of. I felt heat rush to my face, but I kept my voice steady. "What does that mean?" Ryan shrugged. "Operations, training, maybe overseeing a few locations. You're good at that stuff." My mother nodded. "You're such a hard worker. That's your gift." That was the sentence that broke something permanent in me. Not anger, not sadness, detachment. I realized in that moment that they weren't confused. They weren't misguided. They were deliberate. And they had already decided I would never be more than useful. That night, I drove aimlessly for hours until I pulled into the driveway of the only person who had seen my exhaustion without benefiting from it, Mark Sullivan. We'd been dating quietly for almost 2 years. He wasn't part of the business world, which was exactly why I trusted him. I sat on his couch and told him everything, from the first unpaid shift to the savings account I'd drained, to the meeting where my future had been reduced to taken care of. When I finished, he was silent for a long time. Then he said, "Evelyn, you don't sound angry. You sound erased." That word landed harder than anything my parents had ever said. "You built something real," he continued, "and they're acting like it appeared out of thin air." I told him about the power of attorney. His eyebrows lifted. "Have you talked to a lawyer?" I laughed, but it came out hollow. "My parents' lawyer? The one who's been at every family barbecue since I was 12? Mark shook his head. "Not their lawyer. Yours." That night, for the first time, I allowed myself to imagine something radical. What if I didn't fight them emotionally? What if I simply stepped sideways? The next week, I took a personal day. No plant, no meetings, no family. I drove north to McKinney to see someone I hadn't spoken to in nearly a decade. Thomas Reed. He was my father's former business attorney, retired, semi-forgotten, quietly brilliant. When I walked into his office, he looked up from his desk and studied my face for a moment. "You look like someone who's been carrying a company on her back," he said. I laid everything out. The power of attorney, the contracts I'd signed, the patents filed under my authority, the distribution deals negotiated in my name. He read in silence. Then he leaned back and exhaled slowly. "Evelyn," he said, "do you realize what you actually own?" I shook my head. He tapped the documents. "Everything that matters." He explained it calmly, like he was describing gravity. The physical building, the land, those belonged to my parents. But the intellectual property, the client contracts, the distribution rights, the filtration process, all executed under my legal authority. All of that, he said, can be moved. I asked him what would happen if I did. He smiled, not kindly. They'd lose the engine and keep the shell. I felt dizzy. "Is it legal?" He nodded. "Perfectly." That was the moment I reached my point of no return. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I finally understood the truth. They had already taken everything they could from me. All I was doing now was stopping the theft from continuing. Over the next month, I became an actress in my own life. At work, I was calm, efficient, invisible. At home, I was agreeable, helpful, unquestioning. Behind the scenes, I documented everything, every asset, every dependency, every signature. I created a new company quietly, filed paperwork, opened accounts, prepared transfers. My parents signed documents nightly, trusting me like they always had. Just routine, I said. They never read a word, and every signature brought me closer to freedom. The family meeting was scheduled for mid-June. They thought it was my ending. I knew better. Once the decision settled inside me, everything became strangely quiet. Not around me, inside me. For most of my life, my thoughts had been noisy, trying to earn approval, trying to prove worth, trying not to disappoint anyone. Now there was only one question left. How do I leave without destroying myself? I didn't want to scream. I didn't want to expose them publicly. And I definitely didn't want to become the villain in the story they'd already rehearsed for years. I wanted something cleaner, something final. So I followed the law. Every morning, I woke up and went to work like nothing had changed. I still walked the production floor, still solved problems, still signed off on shipments. But every decision now had a second purpose. I started mapping the business the way a surgeon studies anatomy. What created revenue? What depended on what? What could live independently? The answer was uncomfortable, but empowering. The company didn't run on the building. It didn't run on my parents' name. It ran on systems, relationships, agreements, all things I controlled. The first step was separation. I formed a new entity quietly, North Star Pure Holdings. No announcement, no fanfare, just paperwork. Thomas helped me structure it cleanly. Single member LLC, manager managed, no outside visibility. Then came the transfers. Not all at once. That would have raised suspicion. Instead, I spread them out. A revised distribution agreement here, an updated intellectual property assignment there, a temporary operational realignment that quietly moved control of logistics software. Each document looked boring. That was the key. My parents had never read boring documents. They trusted me with boring. Every evening, I brought home folders. I timed it carefully. After dinner, when my father was relaxed, when my mother was distracted. Just cleanup, I'd say. Tax optimization. My father would joke, "If it saves me money, I'll sign anything." And he did. One night, as he scribbled his name, my mother smiled at me and said, "We're so lucky to have you. Ryan could never handle this stuff." I smiled back, because she was finally right. Ryan barely noticed. He was too busy planning his future office, ordering furniture, posting inspirational quotes online, talking about vision to anyone who would listen. He never once asked about supply chains, never reviewed a contract, never questioned why vendors now contacted me directly under a different letterhead. He assumed power would simply arrive, like it always had. The more he talked, the easier it became. Because confidence without competence is invisible to people who don't look closely. And my parents had never looked closely. By early June, everything that mattered had moved. The filtration process, the vendor exclusivity, the national distribution pipeline. All of it now belonged to North Star. Harper Pure still existed, but it was hollow, a shell, a name without leverage. I printed the final documents and sealed them in an envelope. I didn't feel triumph. I felt relief. like setting down something heavy I'd been carrying too long. The family meeting was 1 week away. I prepared exactly 3 items to bring: the master factory key, a summarized copy of the contracts, and that envelope. Not as a threat, as closure. The night before the meeting, I barely slept, not because I was afraid of losing, but because I was finally ready to stop pretending. Mark sat beside me on the bed and asked, "Are you sure?" I nodded. "For the first time in my life," I said, "I'm choosing myself without apologizing." He squeezed my hand. "Whatever happens," he said, "you won't be invisible anymore." That was all I needed. The morning of the meeting, my mother called. "Wear something nice," she said. "This is a big day." I looked at my reflection. 35 years old, tired eyes, straight spine. "I will," I said, and I meant it. I arrived early, sat on the same couch I'd sat on as a child, listened to familiar sounds: Ryan pacing, my father clearing his throat, my mother arranging photos. When everyone was finally seated, my father stood. He smiled and began speaking. My father cleared his throat and stood in the center of the living room, exactly where he had stood for every announcement that ever mattered in our family. "Your mother and I have been thinking about this for a long time," he said, hands clasped behind his back. "We believe it's time to officially pass the company to the next generation." My mother nodded, eyes shining. Ryan sat up straighter, already smiling. "We've decided," my father continued, "to transfer ownership of Harper Pure and all associated family assets to your younger brother." The words landed softly. No drama, no hesitation, just certainty. My mother reached for Ryan's hand. "You deserve this," she said. Ryan laughed, shaking his head like he couldn't believe his luck. "Wow, I won't let you down." I waited. 3 seconds, long enough for the moment to fully belong to them. Then I stood. "Congratulations, Ryan," I said calmly. I walked to the coffee table and placed the master factory key down first. The old brass clink echoed louder than I expected. Then the contract summaries. Then the envelope. Ryan grabbed the envelope immediately. He tore it open. 10 seconds passed. His smile vanished. 20 seconds. His hands began to shake. "This isn't funny," he said, voice cracking. "What is this?" My mother leaned forward, confused. "Ryan?" He looked up at my father. "Dad, it says the distribution rights aren't ours anymore." My father frowned and took the papers from him. His face drained of color as he read. My mother snatched them next. Her breath caught. "No," she whispered. "That's not right." I finally spoke. "It is." My father looked at me, truly looked at me, for the first time in years. "Evelyn," he said sharply, "what did you do?" "I protected what I built," I replied. Ryan stood up so fast the chair scraped the floor. "You had no right! You were just running things! This was never yours!" I met his eyes. "Then why were all the contracts signed by me?" The room froze. My mother's voice rose, shrill and panicked. "You manipulated us. You tricked us into signing—" "No," I said, my voice steady. "I brought you the same paperwork you've trusted me with for a decade. You just never thought I was worth reading." My father slammed his hand on the table. "You're being ungrateful. After everything we gave you." I cut him off. You didn't give me anything, I said. You took. Every year, every hour. And when you were done, you decided to replace me. Ryan stepped toward me, his face red. You ruined everything. You're dead to this family. There it was. The sentence he'd waited his whole life to say. I didn't flinch. I stopped letting you live off my work, I said. That's not ruining anything. That's boundaries. My mother broke down, dropping to the couch. Please, she sobbed. Fix this. Put it back. We're family. I picked up my bag. You made it very clear where I stood, I said quietly. Today, I agreed with you. I placed my house key on the table and walked out. I didn't look back. The aftermath was quiet. Harper Pure collapsed within months. Without the distribution rights, suppliers pulled out. Without the filtration process, competitors swallowed what remained. The building sat empty by winter. My parents downsized fast. Ryan applied everywhere, listing himself as former executive. No one called. Reality doesn't care about entitlement. North Star Pure Holdings, on the other hand, grew faster than I'd ever imagined. We expanded nationally, then internationally. I hired people who were respected and paid accordingly. I slept through the night for the first time in years. Mark and I moved into a small house outside the city. Nothing flashy, just peace. Sometimes people ask if I regret it. I don't, because I didn't take revenge. I took responsibility. I didn't burn bridges. I stopped carrying people who refused to walk. And here's the truth I wish someone had told me when I was younger. If someone only values you when you're useful, they don't love you. They rely on you. And reliance is not loyalty. To every woman watching this who feels exhausted, overlooked, or quietly drained by the people closest to her, your worth is not measured by how much you sacrifice. You are allowed to choose yourself. And when you do, the right life will finally have room to begin. Thank you for listening.